Thank you for tuning in to the Street Writer Podcast. My name is Noah, aka Big Mix. We are doing the abridged history of the brawler. Now, the genre pretty much started in the mid to late 80s, and we're talking about the peak, which is actually the early 90s. So when we last left off, there weren't too many titles that had captured everybody's attention in 92, but we're going to see how 93 actually picked up a number of elements on the genre. So, 1993 saw an increase in the number of brawlers released. Konami was in fine form as they continued to innovate and redefine what the genre meant. Monster Maulers was one of the first experiments between the brawler and the fighting game. The mechanics of the game were very much based on the traditional fighter. The gameplay took place on a 2D plane. Characters could not move into the foreground or background. Players could perform special moves on top of their regular punches, kicks, and grapple attacks. The only thing that would make this game a brawler, or at least what I would consider it to be a brawler instead of a fighting game, was that up to 2 players could battle against a collection of monsters, aliens, and mythological creatures on each stage. The designs were uniquely Japanese, but nothing extraordinary. Konami then turned around and released Violent Storm. It was one of the most random, poorly designed and executed brawlers they had ever released. It was hard to believe that the same people that had developed the X-Men, Ninja Turtles, Simpsons, Aliens, had created this game. It was as formulaic as brawlers got, with absolutely no redeeming value. As time went on, audiences would learn that the team behind this game was not the same classic Konami team. This was an entirely new group. The team that actually made all of the great Konami games, well, they're going to turn up again, but not in the place you expect them to. So, with Violent Storm, the sprites were large, the animation looked rushed, the levels were sparse, the opponents were bland, and the bosses were insipid. Konami was going through the motions and releasing brawlers just because they could. The company that could previously do no wrong had a half-hearted effort wasted on arcade owners. Their hubris would cost them the market share. Even though they pioneered a lot of the fight mechanics in 2D games and were responsible for inspiring the genre through Karate Champ, Data East did not have a strong history with brawlers, especially following after Captain America and the Avengers. Oh yeah, now you know why Data East isn't a big player in the genre. Anyhow, they did create a game. Night Slashers made up for all of that. It was dramatic, gross, and violent. It was as over the top as any brawler there had ever been. It was exactly the type of game the genre lacked. The designs were a bit over the top, with a suit-wearing British vampire hunter teaming up with an American rock star looking monster hunter with cybernetic arms and a Chinese martial artist. The premise was dramatic gold. Monsters, mutants, and the undead had taken over the world. It was up to a trio of fighters to make things right. The characters had specials and super attacks at their disposal as they took on waves of zombies and other undead creatures. The gore, like the violence featured in brawlers, was catering to the taste of guy gamers. What really set this game above the crop of brawlers were the bonus games. Players took turns playing things like zombie bowling, in which players threw zombies from 10 yards out, and zombie whack-a-mole, where players kicked the heads off of zombies as they popped up from holes in the sand. It was an absurd premise as audiences gathered around these zombie events, standing behind barricades emblazoned with sponsor logos like Zombie Burger and Drug Zombies. That dark humor was what Konami had missed in Violent Storm. Sad, of all the arcades I visited, I only saw one dedicated cabinet. With the popularity of zombies, then perhaps we might see this Data East gem come out to PSN or Xbox Live. Capcom did not want to wait around and see what Konami was up to. They secured the rights to another Marvel character and released the violent Punisher title. The game was still a co-op brawler, with Nick Fury filling out for player number 2. Classic villains like the Kingpin were placed alongside modern villains, including Jigsaw and the Bushwhacker. The game retained the Capcom Japanese aesthetic rather than the strict US comic book designs. The studio did, as they always had, placed exaggerated muscles on their figures so they would appeal to Western gamers. Other developers were often unsure of those proportions, so they usually tended to go lean with their characters. The subject matter was a little more intense in order to reflect the Punisher comic books. The Punisher comics were often way more mature and brutal than the regular superhero books. They predated the anti-heroes from titles like Wanted and the Kick-Ass graphic novels. The game itself was violent for brawler standards. When the Punisher pulled the trigger on his guns, opponents went down hard. Capcom kept the intensity up with their next Comic 2 brawler. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs was an indie comic series with a small but dedicated following. The game was based more on the work from the short-lived animated series than from the comic books. The title featured the same impacting gunplay from the Punisher, with the great designs from the comics and animation. The best Capcom title of the year, and for that matter the best brawler of the year, was based on a license. It was neither the Punisher or Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, but instead something that was previously considered the nerdiest of pursuits.
Welcome to the D&D world.
Dungeons & Dragons: Tower of Doom was based on the fantasy role-playing system and brought over a lot of their mythology and design into the brawler. The oldest Capcom fantasy brawlers, including King of Dragons and Knights of the Round, seem to have been building towards the D&D license. The oldest of the fantasy brawlers, Magic Sword, was set in a castle tower as well, some 50 stories tall. It was a brutal but rewarding quarter grabber. The levels were filled with traps and monsters. It predated the Tower of Doom by years. The game did have plenty of different character classes and even a rich narrative. Still, it felt as if something were missing. The D&D license allowed Capcom to bring everything together. The Tower of Doom featured a small group of character classes that players could build through collecting coins, equipment, and potions from defeated opponents. Players could visit nearby towns and upgrade their equipment and restore health with recovered loot. Instead of starting with nothing on each playthrough, the cabinet allowed players to save their progress locally. The attention to detail, character designs, art, and animation were superb to every other title released that year or any year before. The brawler, with role-playing elements, was a long time coming. Capcom waited to apply it to a genre that they had become exceptional at. They knew the ins and outs of the brawler, including the nuances of timing, the difficulty curve, problems with repetition, and boss encounters. While the D&D subject matter was not appealing to all gamers, the lessons learned from its design were invaluable. By comparison, Konami was now going through the motions with each arcade release and losing more steam by the moment. It stood to reason why their best developers were starting to leave the studio and move into console development. Their last brawler of 1993 was Metamorphic Force. The game attempted to marry the fantasy elements of warriors set in a world of shape-shifting monsters. Any of the 4 players could transform into a were-animal, including were-tiger or were-bear. Unlike the clock on Sengoku, the transformations were not timed. The concept was great. It was as if there was a brawling version of Sega's Altered Beast. It was the execution that was lacking. The quality of the designs, brightly colored levels, and sparse gameplay elements felt unpolished. This title felt more lacking than even Violent Storm. It was not, however, the worst brawler released that year. Atari had become aware of the popularity of the brawler. They had been losing a market share in arcades since the late 80s to the Japanese. To try and turn things around, they published their own brawler, developed by a company called Toaplan. Knuckle Bash was unique in concept, introduced some new elements, but ultimately had an abysmal execution. The game was an attempt at making a narrative out of wrestlers and the wrestling business. The story revolved around crooked wrestlers and crime lords tarnishing the good name of pro wrestling. The game began with one of three characters, a masked luchador, an Elvis gimmick wrestler, and a straight shooting wrestler. Three more characters, which were at some point in the game bosses, could be added to the lineup. The game allowed players to switch characters between levels. Adding bosses as playable characters and allowing the switch of characters between stages was a fantastic idea. Unfortunately, the game was formulaic, nonsensical, and had poorly designed characters and bosses. Despite the good ideas, it was one of the worst brawlers ever released. 1993 was an interesting year, but the brawler was steadily declining in popularity. Less and less memorable titles would be released over the rest of the decade. Some of the best experiences, however, were still to come. The very next year, Capcom would release what many consider to be one of the greatest brawlers ever to come out. So we're going to take a look at this title, plus a publisher that had rarely been heard from in the genre. So I hope to see you back for that. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast and would like to sponsor me, please visit my Patreon page. You can find me there. I'm Street Writer, and just consider donating every month. I appreciate everybody that's donated in the past and everybody that's currently donating, and I really look forward to seeing you on the next episode.